I'm Earl McKenna. I've spent my life on the water, and I've got more stories than a net has holes. Some are about the ones that got away, and some are about the ones that took a little piece of you with. This one here, it's about a lesson the lake taught me. A lesson written in rust and deep, cold water. It's a story. Truck, a line that wouldn't break, and the kind of pride that can sink a man faster than any anchor. Back when my spine was straighter and my ambition was a whole lot bigger than my sense, I owned a machine I loved almost as much as the sea itself. She was a Ford truck, a heavy-duty beast from an era when steel was still steel, and you could fix an engine with a wrench and grit computer. I'd bought her used, a rusty workhorse, and spent the better part of 2 years rebuilding her from the frame up. She had a new engine that rumbled like a bear waking from a long winter, and tires that climb a muddy hill without even breathing hard. I'd painted her a deep forest green, the color of the pines that line the shore of the place the story takes place. But the crown jewel, the thing that made her more than just a truck, was the winch I'd mounted on the front bumper. This wasn't some flimsy hardware store toy. This was an industrial-grade electric winch I'd salvaged from an old logging operation. It had 150 feet of thick steel cable and a motor powerful enough to pull a house off its foundation, or so I like to boast. The whole setup was my monument to brute force. My philosophy back then was simple. If you can't outsmart it, outmuscle. I welded the mounting plate to the frame myself, bolted it down with steel thick as my thumb, and wired it directly to a secondary. I called the truck the Admiral because in my mind she was the flagship of my one-man fleet, the commander of any piece of land I chose to park her on. My friend at the time, Caleb, he used to just shake his head and grin. Caleb was a different breed of man. Where I saw a challenge to be conquered, he saw balance to be respected. He was quiet, thoughtful, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he was weighing your soul. "Earl," he'd say, look at the winch, "what in God's name are you planning on pulling with that thing? The moon?" I'd just laugh and slap the cold steel of the bumper. "Anything I want, Caleb, anything at all." That was pride talking, and pride, as I was about to learn, makes for a mighty pull. The stage for my lesson was Lake Atticus. It wasn't on any fancy map. It was deep glacial scar left over the ice, hidden away in the hills, miles from any real town. The water was unnaturally clear near the shore, but a few feet out dropped off into an abyss of blackness. The locals, the few old-timers who knew of the place, spoke of it with a kind of fearful reverence. They said it was bottomless in places, fed by underground springs so cold they'd steal the breath right out of your lungs. And they all told stories of not regular fish. They talked about pike as long as a man's leg and trout swallow a duck whole. But the main legend, the ghost that haunted the deep, was a creature they called Old Hemlock. Old Hemlock was said to be a sturgeon of prehistoric size. Some claimed their grandfathers had hooked into him and been spooled in seconds. Others said they'd seen a shadow pass under their boat so big it blocked out the sun. They called him Hemlock because his hide was said to be as dark and tough as the bark of the ancient trees that lined the lake. He was more myth than fish, a symbol of the lake's untamable heart. And in my youthful arrogance, I decided I was the man who was going to drag that myth out of the water and into the light of day. That's what brought me and Caleb to the muddy north shore of Lake Atticus one cool autumn morning. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. I had the Admiral parked on a small gravelly patch of shore that sloped down to the water. And I had my secret weapon, the piece of gear that made me so sure of my success. It was a brand new type of fishing line, something a fella I knew from the commercial docks had given me to test. It was a spool of braided line, but woven into the synthetic fibers were microfilaments of fine steel wire. He swore up and down it was unbreakable. He'd shown me how he'd used it to tow a small boat. The spool was heavy in my hand, and the line felt cold, deadly. I'd spooled it onto my biggest saltwater reel, a reel designed for marlin and tuna, and mounted it on a rod that more like a pool cue than a fishing pole. Caleb watched me rig it up, his expression a mixture of nation and deep. That's not fishing, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. That's laying seed. It's progress, my friend, I declared, my voice booming a little too loud in the morning. This is how you kill a legend. You don't ask it nicely. You bring bigger gear. You bring overwhelming force. I baited the massive hook with a whole chub, a fish big enough to be a respectable catch on its own. He just sighed and went back to setting up his own modest pole, the one he'd used for 20 years. The thing about this lake, Earl, he said, not looking at me, is that it doesn't much care for overwhelming force. It's got more of that than you could ever dream of. I ignored him, my heart thumping with anticipation. This was it. This was the day Earl McKenna would become a legend himself. I stood at the water's edge, the big rod feeling like a lance in my. With a mighty heave, I cast the line out into the lake. The heavy sinker and bait sailed through the air and landed with a distant ker-plunk far out in the deep, dark water. The sound was swallowed instantly by the immense silence of the place. We sat there for hours. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Caleb caught a couple of decent bass, which he cleaned and put in a cooler. I got nothing, not a nibble, not a twitch. The tip of my rod remained perfectly still, pointing out at the placid surface of the lake like an accusing finger. The initial excitement began to curdle into a stubborn frustration. I was being ignored. The lake, the myth, it was all just ignoring me. Maybe he's not home, Caleb said, trying to lighten the mood. He's down there, I grumbled, my eyes fixed on the line where it disappeared into the black. He's just being difficult. As the afternoon began to wane and long shadows stretched from the pines across the water, I started to think Caleb was right. My grand expedition was a bust. I was ready to reel in my unbreakable line and my wounded pride and head home. I stood up, stretched my stiff back, and put my hand on the reel. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a bite. A bite is a sharp, frantic thing. This was different. It was a slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy pull. The rod tip didn't twitch. It bent slowly and smoothly into a deep, groaning arc. The drag on my reel, which I'd set tight enough to stop a freight train, began to sing. Not the high-pitched, zipping sound of a running fish, but a low, tortured howl of metal on metal as the line was steadily, unstoppable, pulled out into the depths. My heart leaped to my throat. I grabbed the rod with both hands, leaned back, and dug my heels into the mud. It was like being tied to a mountain that had decided to go for a walk. This was no fish. This was something else entirely. This was old Hemlock, and he was every bit as big as the stories said. The fight, if you could call it that, was nothing like I'd ever known. I'd fought big tuna off the coast, battled sharks that could tear a man in two, but this was different. There were no frantic runs, no thrashing on the surface, no head-shaking attempts to throw the hook. There was only weight, a steady, crushing, geological weight. It felt like I had hooked the tectonic plate on which the entire continent rested. Every time I managed to crank a single agonizing turn on the reel handle, the line would simply be taken back, not with a jerk, but with a slow, indifferent pull that made the muscles in my arms and back burn with a fire I'd never felt before. An hour passed, then two. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. My knuckles were white, my teeth were clenched, and sweat dripped from my brow, stinging my eyes. Caleb had long since reeled in his own line. He stood a few paces away, a silent observer, his earlier skepticism replaced by a wide-eyed, solemn respect for the unseen leviathan I was tethered to. He brought me a canteen of water, and I drank it without taking my eyes off the rod, which remained bent in a perfect, desperate curve. "Earl, you gotta be careful," he said, his voice low. "Nothing that lives ought to be that strong. Maybe you're snagged on a waterlogged tree, an old stump the size of a car." "No," I grunted, straining against another pull. "It's moving, not fast, crawling along the bottom. I can feel it. It's alive." And it was. Every so often, I'd feel a slow, rhythmic pulse travel up the line, a movement so profound and powerful it felt less like a living creature and more like the slow beat of the earth's own heart. The shadows grew long, and the air turned cold. My strength was failing. My arms trembled with exhaustion, and my back felt like breaking too. The creature, old Hemlock it had to be, had dragged the line slowly but surely to the left, pulling me along the shoreline until I was standing in mud up to my ankles. The frustration was becoming a bitter poison in my gut. Here I was, Earl McKenna, with the strongest rod, the best reel, and an unbreakable line, and I was being beaten by a fish. The thought was intolerable. My pride, already wounded, was beginning to get angry, and that's when my eyes fell upon the Admiral. She was sitting right there, 20 feet away, a monument of green steel and raw power, her chrome winch glinting in the last rays of the dying sun. The thought started as a whisper in the back of my exhausted mind, a dangerous, arrogant little seed. If a man can't pull it in, a machine can. I looked from the truck to the bowed rod, then back to the truck. The idea blossomed, taking root in my frustration. Overwhelming force. That was my creed. I had the force right here, idling silently. "Caleb," I said, my voice hoarse, "give me a hand." He looked at me, then at the truck, and his face went pale. He knew exactly what I was thinking. "No, Earl, don't you even think about it. That's a fool's errand. Cut the line. Just cut the damn line." "Cut it?" I laughed, a harsh, cracked sound. "Never. This is the catch of a lifetime. I'm not giving up now. I'm just upgrading my tools." "That ain't a tool. It's a truck," he pleaded, his voice rising. "The lake's got rules, Earl. You're about to break 'em all." But I wasn't listening. The fever of the fight, sting of impending defeat, had deafened me to reason. I began the clumsy, dangerous process of transferring the line. I wedged the butt of the rod deep into the mud, using my whole body to keep the tension. With trembling hands, I managed to get the winch into free spool, pulling out the heavy steel hook. The hard part was getting my unbreakable fishing line attached to it. It took both of us. Caleb, despite his protests, wouldn't let me do it alone. I held the rod, my muscles screaming, while he used a pair of heavy pliers to work the line through the eye of the winch hook, securing it with a series of complex, hardened knots I'd normally use for mooring a boat. Connection was made. The thin, steel-laced fishing line was now directly linked to the thick, greasy cable of the industrial winch. My fishing pole, just a guy. The real fight to begin. My 2-ton Admiral versus whatever was at the bottom of Lake Atticus. "Stand back," I ordered Caleb, my voice filled with a renewed, reckless confidence. I scrambled from the muddy bank and climbed into the cab of my truck. The familiar smell of gasoline and old vinyl filled my nostrils, comforting, reassuring me. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, its deep rumble echoing across silently. The headlights cut twin beams across the dark water, illuminating the spot where my line disappeared into the abyss. This was it, the moment of truth. I put the truck in neutral, set the emergency brake, and leaned out the window. "You ready to see a monster, Caleb?" I shouted over the engine's roar. He just stood there, silhouetted against the twilight, shaking his head slowly. I flipped the switch on the dash that powered the winch. A heavy thunk sounded from the front of the truck as the clutch engaged. My hand hovered over the control toggle. Pushing it up would reel the line in. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was for the stories, for the legend. I pushed the toggle. The electric motor of the winch whined, the sound high and piercing in the quiet evening. The steel cable, which had a little slack in it, drew tight with a resounding twang. The whole truck shuddered, settling on its suspension as it took the strain. My unbreakable line, now thinner than a guitar string under the immense tension, rose from the water, shedding droplets that sparkled in the headlights. For a second, nothing happened. The whine of the winch deepened. The engine RPMs dipped as the alternator struggled to keep up. I gave the engine a little gas, leveling it out. Then I felt it. Slow, grudging movement. The line was coming in. Inch by agonizing inch, the winch was winning. A wide grin spread across my face. I'd done it. I was a genius. "It's working," I yelled, sticking my head out the window. "I told you, Caleb. Overwhelming force." But my triumphant shout died in my throat. The steady intake of the line stopped. The whine of the winch motor rose to a desperate scream. And then the thing in the water responded. It wasn't a pull. It was simply a settling, a transfer dominant. A low, groaning sound came from the front of the Admiral, the sound of a frame under a level of stress it was never designed to endure. And then the back tires began to spin. They whined uselessly at first, then they started digging, kicking up mud and gravel, filling the air with the smell of burning rubber and wet earth. The truck wasn't pulling anymore. It was just holding on. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through my pride. I gave the engine more gas, a foolish, reflexive action. The tires spun faster, digging deeper ruts, and then the whole world seemed to shift. The Admiral, my mighty flagship, lurched forward, not with a roll of its wheels, but with a sickening, helpless slide. It moved maybe 6 inches, dragged by the invisible force tethered to its nose. My blood ran cold. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal. The tires locked, but it made no difference on the slick, muddy ground. The truck slid again, another foot this time, the front bumper now hanging over the water's edge. The groaning of tortured steel was louder now, a symphony of my own catastrophic miscalculation. I looked at the unbreakable line, taut bar of steel in the headlight, and I finally understood. Caleb, the lake had ruled. The line wouldn't break, the winch wouldn't quit, and old Hemlock, or whatever demon I had hooked, was a far, far better anchor than my truck. I wasn't the fisherman anymore. I was the bait, was being reeled in. My mind, which just moments before had been clouded with triumph, was now a vortex of pure, adrenaline-fueled panic. Every instinct screamed at me to disengage the winch, to kill the engine, to do something, but my hands seemed frozen, my feet glued to the pedal. The sheer impossibility of the situation had paralyzed me. Trucks pull things. That is their purpose in the world. They do not get pulled, especially not by a fishing. The Admiral gave another violent lurch, sliding a full yard this time. The front tires slipped off the gravelly bank and plunged into the soft, sucking mud at the water's edge with a sickening slurp. Ah! The nose of the truck dipped precariously, and the headlights, which had been aimed at the horizon, now pointed down into the inky blackness of the lake, illuminating a swirling vortex of mud and debris where the line entered the water. The winch motor's desperate scream was the only sound in the world, a mechanical death cry. "Earl, get out!" Caleb's voice cut through my stupor, sharp and terrified. "Get out of the truck now!" His shout broke the spell. My limbs finally obeyed. My hand flew to the winch control, but it was too late to disengage. The tension was too immense. The gears were locked under a load they were never meant to hold. I fumbled for the ignition, twisting the key. The engine sputtered and died, and the sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise. It was replaced by a new sound, the groaning of the earth itself. The entire bank under the truck was giving way. I threw the driver's side door open and scrambled out, half falling into the cold, slick mud. I landed on my hands and knees, the shock of the cold seeping through my jeans. I looked up just in time to see the inevitable happen. With a final deep groan of tearing roots and collapsing soil, the shoreline surrendered. The Admiral, my beautiful, powerful machine, my pride and joy, slid forward with an unstoppable, silent grace. It was like watching a slow-motion tragedy. The front wheels submerged completely, and the dark water of Lake Atticus began to climb the green grill. The winch, still humming with stored electrical energy, finally went silent as the water shorted it out. Its last effort, a pathetic fizz and a puff of acrid smoke. For a moment, the truck seemed to pause, balanced on the precipice, half in and half out of the water, like a great beast taking its last drink. The water lapped at the Ford lettering on the hood. I could only stare, breathless, my heart a cold stone in my... Then, the thing in the deep gave one last inexorable pull. The rear of the truck lifted off the ground. The big tires spun freely in the air for a second, for the entire vehicle pitched forward and plunged into the lake. The sound was not the clean splash I might have imagined. It was a deafening, violent cataclysm of noise, a thunderous as tons of steel displaced the water, followed by a chorus of hissing, bubbling, and the deep, resonant glug of a hollow vessel filling with water. A wave surged back towards the shore, washing over my legs, cold as the grave. I watched, helpless. My Admiral sank. The headlights stayed on for a few eerie seconds beneath the surface, casting distorted, ghostly green beams that danced the churning water before they flickered and died, plunging the scene to near darkness. The last thing I saw was the red glow, a single tail light shrinking as it was dragged down the abyss, and then gone. A profound, ringing silence fell over the lake, broken only by the lapping of the newly settled water against the shore, and sound of my own breathing. The ripples from the truck's entry spread outward, perfect silver circles under the rising moon. The only that anything... The line was gone. The truck was gone. My pride was gone. All of it swallowed different water. Caleb, his hand on my shoulder. I hadn't even heard him approach. I was still on my knees in the mud, staring at the spot where my truck had been, my mind a complete and utter blank. "Are you all right, Earl?" he asked, his voice soft with a mixture of pity and shock. I couldn't answer. I just shook my head, not in denial, but in sheer dumbfounded disbelief. I had set out to conquer a legend, to pull a monster from the depths. Instead, the depths had reached up and pulled my world down. I hadn't caught old Hemlock. Old Hemlock had caught the Admiral. We stood there for a long time, two small figures on the shore of a vast and mysterious lake. There was nothing to say. The evidence of my hubris was resting somewhere at the bottom of Lake Atticus, a permanent steel reef in the darkness, forever tethered to a mystery I would never solve. What was on the other end of that line? Was it really a sturgeon of impossibles, an ancient waterlogged log of petrified wood? Or was it something else? Something that the old-timers knew you didn't challenge with steel and gasoline? I never found out. I never wanted that night. Something inside me broke, and something new began to grow in its place. The arrogant young man who believed in the supremacy of overwhelming force had drowned with his truck. On the muddy shore of that lake, a different man began to emerge, one who understood the vast difference between strength and wisdom. I learned the most expensive and important lesson of my life, that there are forces in this world so much bigger and older than our machines. Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compete. It simply is. And sometimes the bravest, smartest thing a man can do is not to pull harder, but to have the humility to just cut the line. Let the monster keep its secret. Let the mystery remain. Some things aren't meant to be dragged into the light. Some things are meant to be respected and left alone in the deep, dark water where they belong. The walk home with Caleb in the dark was a long one, and we didn't speak a word. There was nothing to say. The lake had said it all. Don't go anywhere. My stories are like a good tide. There's always another one coming in. Stick around and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. True wisdom isn't about having the strength to pull anything from the depths, but having the humility to know when to cut the line and respect the mysteries you can't conquer.